Social Security is only 7 years away from insolvency. If nothing happens, existing Social Security recipients will get a 24% cut across the board. In order to stop that, we need a plan, and that's where Ben Ritz and the Center for Funding America's Future come in. They've just put out a new report on how to save Social Security, how to reform it so that we actually bring in as much revenue as we need to pay out seniors for their Social Security checks. And Ben joins the episode today to talk about that process. Whose benefits will we need to cut? How will we expand revenue? How will we change the system to make it more fair in the end? And why do we care about Social Security as a program that rewards work rather than just as another welfare program? As always, thank you for being a listener to the New Liberal podcast. If you want to support us, the best way to do so is by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Ben Ritz. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you, man. It's always it's good to have you back, and I feel like every time you're here, we always get into like the real nerdiest stuff. Like it's the biggest nerd out sessions we have, which I think is good because number one, it means we really get to dive into policy wonkery stuff. Number two, it just gives me an excuse to call you a nerd. but yeah, glad you're here, man.
People struggle to pass up those opportunities.
Well, we all have our little pleasures in life. But we're here today to talk about a report you've put out on Social Security, which anybody who kind of follows anything about the government knows that Social Security is in trouble. They may not know all the details, but this has been something we've been talking about for quite a long time, that Social Security is in trouble, it's in trouble, and we keep saying that there's bad things that are about to happen. And it seems like we are really actually getting pretty close to the day when we have to do something about it. So before we get into your whole program and all the proposed fixes, can you give us kind of a level set? What is the current state of Social Security? How much more time do we have before it runs out of money? And where are we right now? What is the current baseline?
Sure. So before we get into kind of where we are, we just have to level set about how Social Security works. It's a program where we take the payroll taxes of working Americans and use that to fund benefits for retirees. And those two are supposed to be in rough alignment. There's a trust fund system that's supposed to make sure that those two are roughly equal over time. Before 2010, we were actually collecting more in payroll tax revenue than we were spending on benefits because we had more than 3 workers paying the benefits of each retiree. And that worked for a time. But as our society is getting older, as our fertility rate is dropping and life expectancy is rising, the ratio of workers to retirees is falling. And so since 2010, it has been spending more on benefits than it raises in taxes. Now, because of the trust fund system, it is allowed to run deficits that are commensurate with past surpluses. But in 2032, the bigger of Social Security's true trust funds is going to run out. And at that point, benefits will legally be automatically limited to what can be paid for with incoming revenue. And in practice, what that means is if Congress doesn't act before the end of the next president's term, benefits are going to be cut across the board by 24%.
So this is like 6 years out, basically. There are 6 or 7 years out that this is coming. And if we don't do anything about it, because it's an entirely separate system, right? Like Social Security is separated from the rest of our tax and spend government. It has its own dedicated revenue stream and its own payout system. And so unless we start getting more Social Security revenue or we change the rules, I guess, you can only spend what you make once this kind of pot of surplus money is gone.
Over the long term, that's right. Although I think Social Security actually isn't as separate of a system as it's often portrayed to be. There's kind of this myth that we took the surplus and we put it in a pot, and that pot is the trust fund, and that's just sitting there, and now we're drawing down the trust fund. And really, what happened was when Social Security ran surpluses, we use those surpluses to pay for general government deficits instead of borrowing more money from the public to cover those deficits. Now, Social Security is actually Social Security's deficits are being funded through public borrowing that we would have had to do in the past to finance those previous government deficits. So, what this really means is Social Security isn't really sustaining itself on an annual basis at this point anymore. It really is kind of part of the unified budget deficit at this point in time.
There's a natural question that people will ask, having heard that, okay, if Social Security is actually just part of the regular deficit at this time, and kind of the idea of the surplus, the pot, is kind of a myth. It's an accounting gimmick to some extent. Why not just change the rules such that we can treat Social Security like regular debt? Why not, we issue debt to pay for all this other stuff, to pay for the military and for Medicare and for everything else we do. Why not just make Social Security, an issuance of debt as well?
That's a great question. And there are two big reasons why we don't do that. The first is that Social Security at its conception was designed to be an earned benefit, to have this idea that your benefits are based on what you put in. And for that kind of system to work, and so much of the benefit, so much of the program structure, whether it's the benefit formula or the tax system, you wouldn't design them the way we did unless you were trying to enforce that link between contributions and benefits. So that's one main reason why we keep the trust fund is to keep the premise of Social Security being an earned benefit. The other is that it's an important governor on the engine of spending for what is one of the most popular programs in America. If we were to say it's just part of the general budget, it would be very hard to make a lot of the changes that are needed to make it fiscally sustainable. And if we were to decide, well, when Social Security's trust fund runs out, we're just going to put it on the general budget deficit in perpetuity, not just temporarily, but forever, that would really cause a significant increase in our debt at a time when our debt is already on an unsustainable path.
So we're in a situation where one option is to just do nothing. And if that happens, if nobody does anything, then automatically in 6 or 7 years, Social Security benefits across the board for everybody will be cut by something like 24% or something like that. That is an option. It may not be a popular option. I think it would probably lead to increased poverty among senior citizens, but it's one thing we could do. Or we could actually try to fix the program and make it more sustainable in a way that does not just give everybody a cut across the board. And that is what this recent paper that you've written is all about. The title of that paper, and we're going to link it in the show notes, is Reform That Rewards Work, a New Vision for Strengthening Social Security's Intergenerational Compact. Like most think tank papers, just a blistering title right there. But it is actually a really good read if you like policy wonk stuff, if you like reading about this kind of thing and actually thinking about how we fix America's problems. This one is probably worth your time if you're listening out there. So I'm going to let Ben introduce some of the main ideas, but obviously in order to make this happen, in order to fix Social Security, one of two things has to happen, or both at the same time. We either have to figure out how to reduce the benefits that we're paying out, or we have to increase the taxes that are coming in. So what, in broad strokes, what's the method for doing that you think kind of most fairly fixes the problem?
So before I talk about how to fairly fix the program, I want to talk about what I think are some of the most popular but unfair fixes out there, because our plan was really designed to address what we saw as some of the shortfalls with some of the most common proposals out there. So some of the biggest proposals out there generally will say, let's just fix Social Security by raising payroll taxes, either by raising the rate or that workers pay under a certain threshold, or raising the threshold to which those taxes apply. And our biggest problem with just solving this by raising payroll taxes is that the payroll tax is a pretty regressive tax, and it depresses workers' wages. It undoes a lot of the progressivity of the federal income tax, and it discourages work. And when it was originally designed, the payroll tax rate was something like 2%, and now it is 15%, split evenly between the employer and the employee. And so it's a much bigger burden now than it was originally intended to be. And we think it's a problem to make it even bigger. Then it gets to the question of, okay, well, why don't we just raise the cap? And the problem there is right now Social Security benefits give people higher benefits if they've paid more in taxes. And so if you just raise the cap, you are doing a big benefit increase for high income people and not getting that much savings. And if you raise the cap without giving that benefit increase, you're breaking that link between contributions and benefits that was supposed to be the foundation of Social Security. So we didn't want to do either of those two approaches. So we decided that we wanted to look at trying to make the program better at fighting poverty and more fiscally sustainable by reducing kind of that excess benefit that goes to high earners but doing it in a way that doesn't break the concept of Social Security as an earned benefit system. And so what we settled on was a system that we call a work credit benefit structure, where basically we award benefits based on how many years somebody works rather than what their lifetime earnings were.
And I think it's worth digging into this whole idea of like, this is an earned benefit, because it's something that you've repeated several times here. And it seems that you view this as a really philosophically important point. Totally independent of the math, of the numbers, that there's been a historic linkage between like Social Security is something that you get because you put in your years of work, because you earned this. Can you talk about why that's so important to you and why that's such a vital part of the history of the program?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is, going back to the origin of Social Security, is it was designed to not just be another welfare program. And part of that is, to reward work and promote work incentives. Part of it is that there was a belief that it makes the program more politically resilient. Whether that is true, that it is necessary to be seen as an earned benefit to be politically resilient versus just big and something that retirees get, I think that's a subjective debate. But there's no question that Social Security is the most popular program that our government runs. And so clearly there's something to be said for it having that demonstrated political longevity.
I do think there's something powerful about that, and it, I can't prove this, but I think you're right that it is probably linked to the popularity of Social Security, that it's seen as something you earn rather than something that is just handed to you. And we could spend all day on that, but traditionally the way this has been expressed is that I think it's something like, you know the details better than me, but it's something like you take the average of like your 35 years of work or something like that, and you get some percentage of what you earned during those years. And there's kind of a complicated formula, but it's something to do with that. And so it reflects your actual work. And you're saying that rather than do that, rather than have anything to do with your earnings, this should just be a reflection of the number of years that you worked. We're going to change it from based on a percentage of your earnings to based on how many years you spent in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And our logic there is, right now the current benefit formula is kind of progressive, but it's also kind of not. It does replace a percentage of your historical earnings, but that percentage is higher if you're lower income. So on the one hand, it's progressive because lower earners get a higher replacement rate for the contributions they made into the program. But on the other hand, it's not, because we give the biggest benefits to the people who had the highest incomes throughout their careers and needed them the least. So in practice, because, again, we're paying for today's benefits using the taxes paid for by today's workers, we are taxing middle income workers more so that we can give bigger benefits to wealthier retirees. And so that just doesn't make sense to us, given that the program isn't sustainable, given that past contributions weren't enough to sustain benefits. We think it's time to reimagine the program into something that keeps it as an earned benefit, but does so in a way that doesn't require you to give a bigger benefit to the people who need it.
Would be the kind of distributional effect of this in terms of like baseline, what we have right now? What would be, would low income seniors get a boost? Would high income seniors get a cut? What about middle income seniors? Like what distributionally, who gets affected by this change in what way?
Yeah, so we actually got some great modeling of our plan from the Urban Institute last year. And I should caveat this, that this doesn't reflect just the change to a work credit benefit structure. It also includes the effects of some of our other benefit reforms. So for example, we raised the retirement age to reflect the fact that people are living longer. We make changes to cost of living adjustments so they more accurately capture inflation. There's a number of changes, all summarized in the report. So I'll caveat that this is inclusive of all of those changes. But basically, what this analysis found was that for the average beneficiary who has the standard amount of an average work history and is in the middle income quintile, they're going to see roughly the same benefits they have under the current formula when they start collecting benefits. If you're at the top, you're probably going to get a benefit cut that is roughly equal to what is going to happen under current law when the trust funds run out. But if you're at the bottom, you'll actually get a benefit increase. People who are the lowest lifetime earners and people who work disproportionately longer careers will get higher benefits than they would, not just under current law with the across-the-board benefit cut, but better than they would get under the current formula. Two other really important stats about this. Number one, our benefit would be big enough that anybody who works for 20 years would get a benefit big enough to keep them out of poverty. And under our plan, the poverty rate would be, for Americans over the age of 70, would be 10% lower than under the current formula and 40% lower than under the scenario in which that across-the-board benefit cut is able to take effect. So we got some pretty powerful positive distributional benefits here.
That's an interesting thing to kind of tackle because, when you change the structure of something like this, there's always that question of like cui bono, right? Who benefits? And so I'm glad that you guys have answers ready for that, because that's one of the first things people are always going to ask. But to make Social Security a little bit more progressive, a little bit more tilted towards giving, not quite as much on the high end, a little bit more on the low end for, people who have not earned quite as much money in their lifetime. It's an interesting way to do it. And you guys have a number of other proposals as well that are kind of on the cost side, on reducing costs. And, some of those are related to retirement age. Some of them are, like you said, related to inflation. There's some other stuff in there. Do you want to go over those real quickly? And then I'll ask as by way of a question. When you calculate all this stuff, the change to how you distribute Social Security and the raising of the retirement age and all this other stuff, how close does that actually get us to filling the gap that we need to fill? There's a gap between revenue and payments we want to make. How close do you get with all these things that we're talking about?
Yeah, so just to run through kind of quickly the big benefit changes we make besides the work credit change. So we propose to raise the early and maximum benefits age for Social Security, basically the retirement ages, have them grow with longevity. So the longer people live and the higher life expectancy is, the higher the ages get. But we preserve a special early retirement age for the lowest income and longest career workers, so that if you physically can't work anymore, or you're really put in your due, you don't get big benefit cuts for retiring early. We changed cost of living adjustments so that they grow with what's known as the chain CPI. This is a more accurate measure of inflation that captures substitution effects. When the price of beef goes up, the price of people are more likely to convert to chicken. So change CPI better captures that substitution effect, and that leads to slower growth in cost of living adjustments. But we have benefit increases for the oldest seniors, the ones who would be on that lower cost of living formula for the longest, and also who are most likely to outlive their savings. And so that is a pretty significant component of our poverty reduction plan. We have pretty comprehensive changes to the spousal and survivors benefits as they relate to widows who are disproportionately likely to fall into poverty. And then we make changes to the recently passed Social Security Fairness Act, which purported to make Social Security fairer for people who worked in jobs that weren't covered by Social Security, but in reality, really probably made it more unfair by doing a big windfall for folks with generous public pensions. So these are our primary benefit changes. Altogether, they would close about half of the gap through benefit reforms, and the other half we would propose to close with revenue increases.
One question that I think many people will have about these kind of things before we get to the revenue side is, we hear all these things and all these changes, and some people will wonder, like, well, when are they going to be implemented? Will all this be implemented immediately? Will the retirement age change right away, or will it be kind of shifted in over time? Will there be an exception for people who are currently in the system? And I think a lot of young people especially will have that question because Social Security is such a intergenerational policy, right? It's like there's a lot of complaints from people who are millennials and Gen Z especially. There's a complaint that essentially the boomer generation, the baby boomers, have just run everything into the ground, and all of policy, all of government is built around their needs. When they were kids, we built out a bunch of universities and put a bunch of money into public education. And then when they were, in the job market, we made sure to always have the job market be hot. And now that they're aging, we make sure that they have to get their Social Security. And there's a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, believe that boomers are like the most privileged generation and that it's always been all about them, and are kind of bitter about it. And that leads to the question, well, are the boomers going to have to feel some of this pain? Because their generation has been in charge while this disaster has unfolded. They've brought us to this point. Are they going to feel any of the pain? Or are all these changes, things that will just be implemented 10 years down the line, and it's actually for future generations that are going to have to bite the bullet here?
So a couple points on that. The first is I think the dynamic that you mentioned, that is a big part of why we reject the approach of just raising payroll taxes to cover all of this. I think that would be profoundly unfair. So that does inform our thinking.
Because the what do you call it? The workers right now are, Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, everybody but the baby boomers. If you just raise taxes, it's raising taxes on everybody else to help current seniors. And like you said, that would be somewhat of a ripoff intergenerationally.
I mean, the truth is, it's the Gen Xers might be an even bigger beneficiary of this than the baby boomers if you look at when exactly insolvency happens and how the ages distribute. But yeah, for sure, we don't like the idea that millennials and Zoomers are being asked to pay the entirety of a problem created by previous generations, and those generations would not be required to kick anything in. Now, that said, there's a really important principle in Social Security reform, and it's one that's increasingly hard to uphold. But there's an idea that we shouldn't be making big changes to benefits for current retirees because there's not a whole lot they can do to plan around them and change their behavior to accommodate it. And so our plan has most of the changes phasing in over 10 years. And they're for new beneficiaries. There are some exceptions, like the COLA change takes effect immediately for everyone. But most of these changes, they phase in over time, and they phase in for new cohorts that are retiring. We would, the closer we get to insolvency, the longer we wait to act, the more drastic the solutions will have to be, and it's going to become harder and harder to uphold that principle. You probably have to phase in a lot of these changes faster. But in the intergenerational issue aside, there's also this practical fairness issue that we do have to be cognizant about. And I will say, and this is maybe a good transition to talking about the revenue, that this question of intergenerational fairness was one that we thought about not just in our benefit reforms, but also in our tax recommendations.
All right, so let's talk about the revenue side, because we've been talking about the benefit side and what are we going to do there. And one of the things that ultimately you guys decided in trying to set up the best model for the future of Social Security was that, well, kind of the nature of benefits needs to change. It needs to be based on years rather than income. And it's just, it's probably too difficult to make it work or work in the best way possible in the old system. And it seems like when I was reading over the paper, you've kind of come to a similar conclusion on the revenue side. The revenue traditionally comes from payroll taxes, but it seems like you think it's almost just too hard to make the system work the way it should with payroll taxes, and you're proposing an entirely new way to fund Social Security. Tell us what you think the change is and why this kind of big paradigm shift is needed.
So the reason we think it's needed is because, traditionally the way we've thought about Social Security reform is benefit cuts hit current retirees and tax increases hit workers. And under the current conception, actually, first of all, we really more hit just young Americans purely because current retirees don't actually generally get hit by the benefit changes. And if you're raising the payroll tax, that's only hitting working Americans. So we wanted to find an approach on the revenue side that didn't just ask more of working Americans, but asked more of everybody to kick into a problem that is a problem that's going to affect everyone. And so what we settled on was, rather than raising payroll taxes to close the gap, it would make sense to look more at consumption taxes, because consumption taxes affect everybody relatively equally. The higher income you are, the more you spend on consumption. But if you're working or if you're not working, you're going to spend more on consumption. You're going to spend a roughly equal amount on consumption. And so this was a way of making everybody pay in more. And I think there's a lot of folks who would be concerned about the effect that this has on older Americans, but the cost of living adjustments for Social Security would actually protect kind of the lowest income and the people who depend solely on Social Security from really being adversely affected by the consumption taxes. So really, doing it through a consumption tax is a way to make everybody of means contribute more to solving this challenge, rather than just asking more of working Americans. And the last point I'll make on this is, I think this is a change that's kind of only possible with our work credit reform, because if you were to try to keep the current system in which benefits are based on contributions, but then the way we pay for benefits is through a new tax system that doesn't actually track contributions, there isn't really that link anymore between contributions and benefits that makes sense. I think this was a change that was only really made sensible by our conversion to a work-based system.
I mean, in an international sense, can you talk about how does this work in other countries? Because I know that there are other countries that have consumption taxes. What are their systems like? Is there any individual system that you think would be a good example for this is how it would work? This is what it would mean in practice. This is why we think this is, economists think this is a better type of tax than the payroll tax.
So the truth is, all these different countries have different systems. Some of them use payroll tax financing. Others, like Australia, they actually have a much more privatized system where instead of kind of this pay-as-you-go retirement system, people have individual retirement accounts with mandatory contributions into that. So it's really there's just a whole range of different systems. But what I think is really important to get across is whether it is directly earmarked for social insurance programs or whether it's part of the general budget, no developed country that has any sizable welfare state of the size of the US or bigger funds it without needing some sort of consumption tax. Because the reality is, everybody needs to contribute into programs for programs to benefit everybody. It's just not possible to fund those kind of programs. It's not possible to fund these systems just on the backs of the top 1% of earners. Everybody really has to contribute to make them work mathematically.
The 1% thing is really interesting to me because you sometimes see this sleight of hand, right? Where, like, especially on the more progressive end of the Democratic Party, someone will point out, like, hey, we could pay for the new child tax credit just by taxing people who make over $400,000. And okay, maybe that's actually true. But then they will also say, hey, we could fill the gap that we have in Medicare by taxing people over $400,000. Hey, we could shore up Social Security by taxing people who make over and they'll use that one pot of money to do every single line item on their agenda, from the Green New Deal to Social Security to everything else. And it's like, maybe you could use that pot of money. You could go for that. It does exist, but it can't be used to fund everything, right? Like, the money runs out at some point.
That's exactly right. And that's a big part of why we didn't go for the approach of just scrapping the payroll tax cap. Not only because it wouldn't fill the whole hole, but it would also, it would gobble up basically the entirety of that outstanding revenue. The payroll tax rate right now is combined 15%. You add that to the top ordinary income tax rate and state income taxes, and we're pretty close to the revenue maximizing tax rate on the highest earners. Now, I'm okay with that level of taxation. That's what we proposed in our budget blueprint last year, roughly speaking. But if you take all of that money and you use it just to finance the existing Social Security system, that doesn't leave you anything to deal with all the other problems that we're facing, such as Medicare. I mean, Medicare, the gap between Medicare's dedicated revenue and spending over the next 30 years is going to grow by an amount that is bigger than the total gap facing Social Security. And so for us to just take this big, probably the politically easiest pot of money and just throw it here and not have any solution for the rest of the budget, we think would be pretty dangerous. And that's one of the reasons why we explicitly came out against that, quote unquote solution in our report and wanted to advocate for something that includes both broader base taxes and benefit reforms.
So we've got kind of a blueprint here, and I encourage people to read the full report if they want all of the detail. But we increase the amount of money coming in by switching to a consumption tax system, and we think that's better because economists just think consumption taxes are better than payroll taxes. They don't discourage work. They're more broad-based, and we can increase the amount of revenue coming in. We can also cut benefits, frankly, is what we're going to have to do, but we can do it in a smart way that mostly hits, very, very high earners, people who've earned a lot of money in their lifetime and are probably okay. And through a combination of those changes, we think we can make Social Security a solvent system that is set up for success in the future, that's not going to go bankrupt. The next question is, of course, politics. The politics of this are impossible, it seems, most of the time, but they're not going to be impossible forever because we are going to hit that, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. As we get closer and closer to this, there's going to be an increased amount of pressure to do something. So I guess my question here is just, I don't know if you can play Nostradamus, but like, at what point do you think that someone will finally have to take this seriously? At what point do we actually start seeing the push for real reform?
I mean, so the truth is, I think it starts in the next presidential election. At a minimum, it would be, no later than the one after that, because as we said, the bigger of Social Security's two trust funds runs out before the end of the next president's term. And so we have to start having a conversation about what to do about this. I think, the politics are always going to be hard. And I think there will be some pressure to just say, either just do a tax increase, or if, we have sufficient pressure not to just raise taxes on working Americans, then there'll be a pressure to pay for it with general revenue, to borrow the money. And I think, we already saw recently some growing bipartisan support for a proposal that has a lot of financial gimmicks, but at a fundamental level is just borrow the money to pay the gap. And so, I think the politics of it are going to get, there's going to be more pressure to have a solution, but, is it going to be a good solution or a silly solution? I think we'll have to see. We did aim in this proposal to do something that is, as politically plausible as thoughtful Social Security reform can be. We aim to minimize poverty and strengthen the safety net in ways that progressives should like. We reduced the deficit and minimized anti-growth taxes, which are things that we think conservatives should like. And we tried to spread the pain evenly across generations, so that neither working Americans or retirees could say they were being unfairly targeted. But even with what we think is a very generationally and politically balanced plan, the reality is, Social Security reform is always going to be hard. That's the political reality. The mathematical reality, though, is it is necessary, and it is only going to become more painful and more difficult the longer we wait.
I guess I will close the episode here by just lamenting that I think you're right that this will have to wait till the next presidential administration, because Donald Trump certainly will not do anything that will be unpopular. He's happy to pass the buck on any issue, certainly on this one. And so,
well, he won't do anything unpopular on this. He's done quite a lot of unpopular stuff in other issue areas.
Fair. I think he has very good instincts with regards to, back in 2016, all the Republicans were talking about the need to basically do stuff with Social Security and change things. And he was the only one who stood up and said, I'm not touching it. I love your Social Security. I'm never going to cut it. And whether you think that was a good idea or not, it was a popular idea. And I think that's a large part of what won him the primary in 2016 was being the only Republican who said, I love Social Security and I will never touch it. But I mostly just lament this because there's a pretty good chance a Democrat gets elected in 2028 and then gets stuck with having to do an immensely unpopular thing because nobody else dealt with it before now. And like that, it just sucks.
I will say I do lament that a Democrat's going to be stuck with it, but we do have to be honest here. The Democratic Party has its fair share of the blame for getting us to the current position. I mean, a lot of folks in our party did a lot of demagoguery around previous Social Security reform efforts, and I think even just last administration, one of there was a big unfunded benefit expansion signed right at the end of the Biden administration, and so I think it will suck if we're the ones holding the bag. It would it's probably still better that we have it than Republicans who would do it in a much worse way. But I think both parties really contributed their share to the problem, and so I won't really have tears for either party then having to deal with having to reap what they sowed, even if I might feel bad for the particular office holder who has to deal with the problem.
Well, you heard it from the man himself, and I will say that one more time, the report on Social Security reform from PPI, it's in the show notes if you want to read it. Ben Ritz, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.